Now, we've talked about a lot of ideas about how to understand a system that already exists. Let's dig into actually analyzing how the system is performing. And the tricky part about analyzing systems is that there's no such thing as a system in stasis, right? You can't stop the system, pick it apart, understand it all, and then press the play button and have the system start. You have to analyze the system while it's in operation. That's difficult to do, but it's not impossible. It just requires a little bit of a different approach to do it well.
Analyzing systems. Questions for reflection. What approach are you currently using to analyze the systems you come in contact with every day? Are you trying to analyze systems as if they're static?
The first way, this is the general technique that we use to analyze systems. This is called deconstruction. Now, deconstruction is the process of separating complex systems into the smallest possible subsystems to help you understand it. So let's say you pop the hood of your car and you look at what's inside. To me, I don't know a whole lot about how cars work. There's a jumble of parts in there. I have no idea where to begin. So if I wanted to understand how a car works, it really helps to try to follow, going back to the inflows and the outflows. Where can I perceive an inflow? Where do I perceive an outflow? And try to mentally break that system apart into some smaller systems that I can understand. So I may start, let's say I know that one of the inflows a car engine needs to work is gasoline vapor into the engine. That's an inflow. I start there. There's a little pump-looking thing that I'm assuming gets the gas to somewhere else that it needs to go. So I can mentally deconstruct that part of the system, the gas pump. It's okay, how does the gas pump work? What is the inflow? What is the outflow? What happens in the meantime? And where do I go from the gas pump into the other parts of the engine? And you can break apart the gas pump and the spark plug and the transmission and all of these things until you understand how the car as a whole works. So that's the general technique. When you've identified the subsystems, you can mentally isolate them to see how they work and what part they play in the bigger picture of the operation of the system as a whole. So it makes something that's very complex and may feel very overwhelming. You're just breaking it down into a small part that you can understand. And once you understand it, you integrate it into how the larger system operates. So techniques like diagrams and flowcharts and illustrations and process descriptions are all super helpful here because it can help you deconstruct a very complex thing into something that's far easier to understand.
Deconstruction. Questions for reflection. Can you break down the system you're analyzing into smaller subsystems, then isolate them to understand how they work? Can you diagram the inflows, processes, and outflows? Where does one subsystem begin, and where does it end? How do the subsystems fit together?
Now, measurement is the process of collecting data as a system operates. So measurement is useful because it allows you to compare systems with each other. You can compare the performance on a couple of variables of car A versus car B, or the performance of light bulb A versus light bulb B across all sorts of different things. But measurement is just collecting data as the system is operating. And measurement is one of the best ways to avoid things like absence blindness. Because there are some measurements that you can take, like particularly rate measurements. Let's say something in the car engine is spinning, and we want to take a measurement like rotations per minute. That's not something we are equipped to just look at an engine and say it's operating at X rotations per minute, right? We can't do that. But by using devices to collect this information for us, we can get a lot more information about how the system is operating and how that compares to other things that we know exist. It's also a good way to find potential issues in the system you may not be able to perceive just by looking at it. The measurements of the system may indicate that something is wrong before you're ever able to see it. So the first step in analyzing and improving a system is collecting data about how the system is operating. Once you have the data through measurements, then you can do something about it.
Measurement. Questions for reflection. What are the critical parts of the system you're analyzing? What could you measure to determine how well the system is operating?
Once you have measurements, some measurements are more important than others. Not every measurement is equally important. So the measurements that identify the critical parts of a system are called key performance indicators, often abbreviated KPIs. So a KPI is what defines a great performing system. What are the measurements that most closely correlate with high performance of that system? So think of the 5 parts of every business. Those are the critical things that every business must do. So the key measurements you must collect for your company are going to be related to value creation and marketing and sales and value delivery and finance. Everything else, by definition, is less important. And of those things, depending on what it is that you do, some of those measurements are going to be more important than others. So, for example, Dan, in your business, in terms of the value that you're creating, what are some of the key measurements that you take a look at?
Well, we take a look at people being on a website. I mean, just as simple as web traffic. If traffic is bad, that tells me you're not telling a good story. If people aren't interacting with you online, so we use like Facebook interaction as a KPI, because if people aren't interacting with you, you're not telling anything good. We also look at the bottom line. People aren't making donations.
Yeah, how many donors do you have?
Right.
What's the average number of dollars that a donor donates?
Right.
Those types of things are directly related and are super important to Dan's business. Take a business like Chipotle. Dan's KPIs make no sense
No.
at all. Total gibberish.
Yeah.
So it's important to understand that the set of KPIs that are going to be critical for a business is entirely dependent upon the business structure that you're looking at. It's always going to be a little different. But if we're talking about a business system, the KPIs are going to always be related to the 5 parts of every business. That's where you start. And in general, this is a rule of thumb that I've developed over the years. You usually have no less than 4, but no more than 6 key performance indicators that end up being the really most important ones you have to look at, because you'll get buried. It's very easy to track 100 different performance indicators, and then you're not able to figure out what's important. You start drowning in a sea of data, and it doesn't help you. Now, you also need at least 4, because Avinash Kaushik, who wrote a really wonderful book called Web Analytics, An Hour a Day, really, really smart guy when it comes to measuring things that matter. And one of the things that he said is, there is no such thing as a God KPI. There is no one single number that will tell you everything you need to understand about how the system is operating. Every metric, every measurement that you take can only be understood in the context of comparing it to other measurements. So you need at least 3 or 4 to give you that context. Once you start hitting about 6, that's where you start to reach the point of diminishing returns, where measuring more things isn't helping you as much as just focusing on the critical parts. And a lot depends on how easy it is to collect the data in the first place. So for personalmba.com, I'm running an analytics package called Google Analytics, which tracks all sorts of insanely detailed stuff about everything.
For free?
For free, which is kind of nice. But I don't pay attention to all of the data that Google Analytics tells me. In fact, the vast majority of it I never look at. But it's easy to collect a lot of information in the background, and when I want to go in and do an analysis, it's there for me to do if I think it's important enough to pay attention to. But in general, you only want to collect as much information as is easy and worth it to collect up front, and focus in on just a few key metrics that tell you what you need to know. And going to the cost point, if collecting 600 different pieces of data made the cost of the program go up by a factor of 10, that's probably not worth it, as long as you're taking this encyclopedia of data that you have and really going through and trying to figure out what's most important. That's where the data becomes useful, not just measurements in a database somewhere. But I can tell you, The last position I was in working for Procter & Gamble was digital analytics, so marketing measurement for online media spend for Procter & Gamble globally, which was in the hundreds of millions of dollars. And I can tell you my recommendation, because there was no framework to understand what was important. My recommendation on what to look at in terms of key performance areas was 6 things across 2 different types of online marketing strategies that P&G was doing. So I had a set of 6 KPIs for one strategy and a set of 6 KPIs for the other. And that was it. There's your dashboard.
Key performance indicator. Questions for reflection. What are the key components of the system you're examining? How can you measure them? Of those measurements, what is the set of 3 to 5 key performance indicators that will give you the most important information about how the system is performing?
Now, in talking about measurement, it is important to remember a very old adage, which is if you put garbage into your system, you will get garbage out of the system. And this applies to data, maybe more so than anything else. So garbage in, garbage out is a principle that says if you put useless input into a system, you'll get useless output. So it's important to be mindful when you're collecting data about the performance of a system. The quality of the analysis, and therefore the quality of the decisions that you make from that data, is going to be directly dependent on the quality of the data you initially collect in the first place. So if you want to make sure you're making the best decisions you possibly can, it pays to look at the quality of the measurement input and make necessary changes to improve that quality over time.
Garbage in, garbage out. Questions for reflection. What is the current quality of the inflows to your critical systems? What is the current quality of the data you're collecting about the system? How can you increase the quality of the inflows into your critical systems?
This concept is very closely related with another concept called analytical honesty. And there's a justifiably famous quote by P.C. Hodgel that says, "That which can be destroyed by the truth should be." And analytical honesty means measuring and analyzing your data dispassionately. So I'll tell a story of my days in marketing measurement at P&G. Early on in my analysis of the ways that P&G was collecting information about our online marketing spend, we found an issue, and it was a big one. We found that one of the systems we were using to track how many people were visiting a website, which is one of the things that was kind of important for us to measure, was overstating its traffic by 2 to 3 times. So all of our numbers were inflated across the board. Every single thing that had been using this system for almost a decade, it was garbage data. Because one of the things that the system was doing was tracking a visit from a search engine like Yahoo, which was pinging the site once every couple minutes as a human visitor to the website. So that's a major garbage in, garbage out situation. If we have no accurate data of how many people with brains that buy dishwashing detergent are actually coming to this website, we can't make good decisions based on this data. So we went to all of the brand teams who are responsible for managing all of these different websites, and we said, hey, we have a problem. The system that we're using is not working. It's giving us data that is misleading us. Here's a system we need to install that's going to give us the data that we need. And I'm sorry to report, every single brand team that we went to said, I don't want to do that. Because the numbers that I report to my president are going to be cut in half or cut in a third. And the question is going to be, why aren't you doing your job? Why aren't so many people visiting our website anymore? I said, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to take that risk. And I believe that that situation has been remedied, and it was remedied at the very highest levels, saying, I don't care what you do, you're going to install this system because, and everybody's traffic's going to take a hit, and everybody's going to know that it's because of the new system, but it had to come from the top down because there was a lot of concern about the perception of that change in data. So it's important to understand that when you're analyzing data, your analysis is only as good as the data is. And if you're willing to misrepresent the data in the first place, you're not going to get very good conclusions out of the data. So a large part of analyzing a system is being very dispassionate about it. You have to separate yourself from what you want to see in the data, and you have to start looking at what the data is actually telling you. And the best way to do that is to have your measurements and have your systems evaluated by somebody who doesn't care about this stuff nearly as much as you do. So having that outside eye look at your processes and see if they make sense to that person who has no stake in the game can give you much better results. And the more honest you are, the more dispassionate you are in the analysis of your data, the better the analysis you'll make and the better results you'll get. Depending upon the strategy of the particular brand, if they launched a new, very expensive, top-tier marketing campaign against some of the data in that system, and that didn't translate into dollars in the bank, that could have been catastrophic. And it's funny that a lot of times, even in some of the more traditional measurement areas, sometimes you'll find a flaw in a methodology you've been using for a really long time, and you'll find out that it has been misleading you in some important way. And I think that's kind of going back to the things of there is some uncertainty, there is some change. Like all of these things may be applicable for a certain amount of time, and then things change and you need to change too. So there's no such thing as the perfect, accurate measurement system.
Well, it also reinforces that there's no one, what you call a master KPI.
No, there's not. The God KPI, yeah, it doesn't exist.
Analytical honesty. Questions for reflection. To the best of your knowledge, are your current measurement practices accurate? What can you do to prevent incentive-caused bias and confirmation bias from compromising your ability to examine the system objectively?
Now, talking about using the 4 to 6 KPIs, there's a reason we do that, and it's called context. And context is the use of related measurements to provide additional information to the data you're examining. So aggregate measures by themselves are next to worthless because they lack context. So for example, you made $1,000 in revenue last month. Is that a good or a bad thing?
I don't know,
Yeah, depends on the context. Why don't you know?
because I don't know what my profit margin was. I don't know how much came out of inventory. I don't know
What your expenses
what
were,
my expenses
$2,000.
were
Yes.
that attached to that. I don't have no cost of goods. I don't know anything.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, even just take the same measure, dollars of revenue. I don't know how many dollars of revenue I had last month. If it was 0, yay, I made $1,000 that I didn't make last month. That's a good thing. If I made $1 million last month and I have $1,000 this month, something is seriously, seriously wrong, right?
You're in the Halloween mask business.
Exactly. And that's actually a really good point. If you are in the Halloween mask business and your revenue looks like that, where you have $1 million one month and $1,000 the next, having the context of what last year's sales looked like would tell me that that's a normal thing and that I shouldn't be worried about it, right? But without that context, that single revenue number means nothing. So that's an example of a single number examined by itself. Doesn't matter what the number is. A single number examined by itself means nothing. It always takes on meaning when it's compared to other numbers that give that number context, help you understand what it actually means. We were talking earlier in finance, my financial tracking every month. If my operating expenses skyrocket, it's probably because I'm holding a Masterclass. I'm renting a space I usually don't rent. I'm taking people out. There are things that I don't spend on at any other time in the year except for running a Masterclass. And having the context historically and knowing what is associated with what is what prevents that from being worrisome.
Context. Questions for reflection. How often do you rely on a single measurement to tell the whole story? Which measures would help make your understanding more comprehensive and accurate?
Now, Another measurement and analysis related idea is called sampling. And sampling is the process of taking a small percentage of the total output and using it as a proxy for the entire system. There's a great quote by the founder of ComScore, Gian Fulgiani, I think is how you pronounce that. If you don't believe in sampling theory, next time you go to the doctor and he wants to take a little blood, tell him to take it all. So a lot of times it's either too expensive, either in terms of resources or attention or energy, to measure everything that your system is producing. So think of any sort of assembly line. Let's manufacture cell phones now. So lots of cell phones are rolling off the assembly line. It may be really expensive and really time and effort intensive to have a person pick it up, look at every single one, test out every single button, test out every single feature before they say, okay, this was a good one. So that's not what companies do. They choose to test a certain fraction, a certain percentage of the units that are rolling off that line. And if the percentage is good, then chances are there's a high probability everything's okay. If errors start showing up when they do the sampling, chances are those errors started somewhere around the time when the sample was taken. So they know to stop the line, to change things, and to look at those surrounding things to make sure they catch all of the errors that were made. So sampling can help you identify systematic errors quickly. And if you use a sampling strategy, you really need to make sure to test a random and uniform sample. So testing, let's say the cell phone production line starts, and you test the first 10 units off that line and say, yep, working. Everything's good, let it rip. Testing that first 10 units, something may change in the system that starts making errors. So it needs to be random, or at least like every 10th or every 20th, interval or random, works either way. And whether you choose interval, strict interval, or random largely depend on how costly errors are. So random sampling can help if it's not super, super critical that you catch errors just as they're being made. If you need to be super, super sure, your sample size should increase. So sampling, the general rule there is good for quick tests of quality without incurring huge costs. Gets you the data you need, far less expensive way to do it.
Sampling. Questions for reflection. Should you test the total output of the system, or would sampling be sufficient? What is the largest sample you can feasibly collect?
Now, a confidence interval is the probability that a particular analysis is correct. And the more samples you take, the higher the probability your confidence interval is correct. So if you only test, let's say, 1 out of every 2,000 phones that roll off of this assembly line, you can make a prediction about the quality of those phones, but you're not going to have as much confidence in the accuracy of your assessment as if you would sample 1 out of every 2 phones. The more samples you take, the more data you have. The more data you have, the more confident you can be in your particular analysis. So if you're testing pacemakers, you better be sampling on a pretty consistent basis, because that's a really important thing. But if you're noticing you aren't making a whole lot of errors, you can, for reasons of cost, choose to sample less if you're willing to deal with a lower confidence on the accuracy of your assessment. If that's a good trade-off for you, then that's a trade-off that you can make.
Confidence interval. Questions for reflection. How confident are you in the quality of your measurements and analysis? Is it possible to increase your sample size to add confidence to your assessment?
Now, a ratio is a method of comparing 2 measurements against each other. A common way of doing a ratio is you divide your results by your inputs, and you can construct a ratio out of pretty much anything. Take 2 numbers, divide them by each other, either use it as a number itself, or convert it to a percentage, if that's appropriate, and voila, you have a quick and easy way of comparing 2 numbers. Fully generalizable, you can do it against anything. So a lot of particularly business school textbooks like to sound really impressive by having like this compendium of 500 ratios that you absolutely must need to know to run a business. All you really know is how to create a ratio. And if you want, seriously, and if you understand the system well enough, and you understand the critical inputs and the results, you can construct your own ratios. And a lot of those ratios end up being your key performance indicators. It's not like there's not a whole set of things you have to absolutely go out and memorize and use in every context. Just understand what a ratio is, and you can use it to do anything you want. And the ratios can be a very useful way of compressing the information you need to look at. So some of your key performance indicators may not be things like units. It may be a ratio like errors per units produced, closing percentage, all of those things. They're just all ratios. It's comparing one number against another and looking at the ratio and how the ratio is changing over time versus looking at the units themselves. So really all you need to know is the technique. In ratios, it's one of those things that it's pretty simple, it's pretty basic. You can do it for all sorts of different things. And as long as you understand the system well enough to construct an intelligent ratio, calculating it's really easy. And you just track it over time. It becomes one of the data points that you look at.
Ratio. Questions for reflection. What ratios could you construct that would make it easier to see relationships between critical parts of your business? Which measurements are particularly important to consider? Are they important enough to be key performance indicators?
Now, it also helps when you are looking at data about how your system is running to have an idea of what typical is. And when most people think of trying to calculate what's typical, they think of an average or a mean. So let's define some of this stuff. A mean is calculated by adding the quantities of all data points, then dividing by the total number of data points available. So add it all up, divided by how many you have, is your average. So means are great because they're simple to calculate, but they're prone to having outliers that skew the average too high or too low to be a very accurate example of what typical is. So if my good friend Bill Gates decided to drop by to this masterclass, the average net worth of a person in this room would immediately skyrocket, right? Exactly, and we would all be, on average, billionaires, but our bank accounts would not change. It's just he's so far of an outlier that he skews the mean higher than it otherwise would be. So if I advertise the Masterclass as the average net worth of a Masterclass attendant was a billionaire, I would be misrepresenting reality. But it happens in advertising all the time. There's a really wonderful book called How to Lie with Statistics. And it talks about all the ways to be analytically dishonest and make numbers and graphs and charts appear to say things that they don't. And it's written in a very wry tone because by showing you all of the ways that statistics and measurements can be abused, you really become much better at seeing something like the average net worth of a participant is a billionaire and starting to question, like, well, how did you come up with that number?
Well, it also comes into that idea of that one number doesn't mean anything.
Yes, it is only meaningful in context, yes.
And if you have these other numbers, you can get a better idea of what is actually going on.
Precisely. So the second way to calculate what's typical is called a median. And that's calculated by sorting the values from high to low, then finding the quantity of the data point in the middle of the range. So differently, what is the 50th percentile of the data set that we're looking at? What's in the middle? And that middle, within a rough order of magnitude, is a typical number for the data set that you're looking at. So half the battle is just knowing something like a median exists, and then you calculate the mean and the median, and you compare the two against each other, and if your average is way higher than the median, there's some outlier affecting that.
But the median of everybody's net worth in the room is between $500,000 and $1 million, and Bill Gates was $100 million.
Yep. The median would be closer to what the average would be if Bill Gates weren't in the room.
Yeah.
Because the 50th percentile, even adding an additional person, Bill Gates, to it, is not going to skew the median that much. So half the battle here is understanding that there's more than one way to calculate what's in the middle of a set of values. And you can actually, if you have a set of data, it's pretty trivial to calculate all of these things. And then they use them as contrast against each other. So a third way, which is useful in some circumstances, called a mode. So it's the value that occurs most frequently in the set. So if you have a set of data and you have 10 people that make $100,000 every year and you have 3 people who make $1 million, the mode of the set would be $100,000 because it shows up the most often. Now, a mid-range is the value halfway between the highest and the lowest data point. So if, for example, earnings, take the lowest earner, take the highest earner, add them, divide by 2, and that's the mid-range. Very, very prone to be wildly inaccurate, particularly given Bill Gates syndrome, but can be really, really useful when you need a quick and dirty somewhere in the middle of it. It's a wonderful book called Street Fighting Mathematics that was written by a professor at MIT. And it talks about a whole bunch of different ways to very quickly get a rough estimate when you don't have much information. So in terms of raw accuracy, mid-ranges frankly aren't that useful. In terms of quick and dirty street fighting mathematics, when you need kind of a rough order of magnitude, good enough. And there are various levels of sophistication that you can bring to bear on how you analyze the data that you have at your disposal. It mostly has to do with how complex a system are you dealing with, how important is the accuracy of the results that you're generating, and is the investment in producing those analyses worth the cost of producing them? If it is, spend the time, do the extra analysis.
Mean, median, mode, and mid-range. Questions for reflection. Would using a mean or average be appropriate for the analysis you're conducting? Or would using a median or mode be a more accurate assessment? How can you remember to use a median instead of misusing an average?
Correlation and causation. So causation is a complete chain of cause and effect. One thing causes something else to happen, that causes something else to happen, that causes something else to happen, right? If A, then B. Correlation is not causation. This is one of the big laws of science. Just because one measurement is associated with another doesn't mean it was caused by it. So for example, sometimes in the news you'll see something along the lines of, on average, a person who suffers a heart attack eats 5,862 cheeseburgers in their life. And the implication is that cheeseburgers cause heart attacks. The same line of reasoning applies to the average person who has a heart attack goes to bed and sleeps for a couple hours every evening. So sleep causes heart attacks. Doesn't make sense. Just because there's a... right.
Living causes death.
Right. Right. So just because there's some association doesn't mean there's a causative relationship there. So it's important to really internalize that principle. Correlation is not causation. However, great quote by a famous statistician and information design expert, Edward Tufte. Correlation isn't causation, but it sure is a hint. So just because correlation is not causation doesn't mean you should ignore all the correlations. There's probably something to learn there. Look for the correlation.
Look for the correlation and not just assume it's there.
And the more your system changes, the more complex the system is, the more the causative elements of the system are harder to find. But you can still find correlations that will bring you to it. This also comes back to a fundamental principle of designing scientific experiments, which is change one variable at a time instead of changing 50 variables at a time. Because if you change too many things at once, it's going to be really difficult to figure out what really caused what. But the less you change and the more you measure just single changes at a time, the easier it is to kind of work your way into what's really causing what.
Correlation and causation. Questions for reflection. Are you seeing true causation? or just a correlation? How can you isolate variables so it's easier to observe the effects of the changes you make?
Now, the idea of norms are measures that use historical data to provide context for current measurements. So the example that we used earlier of the store that sells Halloween masks, that has sales drop off between October and November every single year, that could be seen as abnormal unless you look at the historical norm, which was this time last year, we experienced the same thing. That particular phenomenon is called seasonality. So around Christmas time, you're going to sell more Christmas ornaments than you would at other points in the year. So using norms, collecting data over a long period of time as a way of providing context for information that you're collecting now is very, very helpful because it can help you learn what's typical. It can also help you learn from past mistakes that you've made. Now, it's important to understand that when your measurement practices change, the norms that were based on the previous measurements are no longer valid. And here's an example from my market research days. Before showing an advertisement on the web, we actually had a series of research panels that we would take it through where we'd show it to a small group of people. We would measure a bunch of different things. Those series of measurements would give us a series of scores, and we would use those scores to decide whether or not this was a good piece of copy that we should put on the internet, or whether it wasn't so good and we should throw it out and try something else. Now, we had been using one system for a period of years, and there was another methodology of doing roughly the same thing that came out that looked or had the promise of being more accurate. So we were evaluating the two systems, trying to decide which one we were going to continue to use. And if we decided to move to the second system, the scores that it would generate could never be compared to the scores that were generated by system one. This is the classic apples and oranges example. The measurements came from different systems, so you can't compare one versus the other. It was a fundamentally different methodology. So if you change the measurement methods, you invalidate any of the historical norms that you're relying on based upon how those measurements were taken. Now, also important to understand that past performance is no guarantee of future performance, right? Historical norms give you some context about work in the past. They are not a crystal ball that will tell you what will perform in the future. So the situation that you're measuring, the environment that you're measuring, is not the same environment as you're measuring right now. So just be careful. Norms are very useful in providing context if you have large amounts of data at your disposal. Just understanding when you're comparing against a past period, understand the changes in the environment. You just have to be aware of what you're doing. So one of the most common norms is performance versus year ago. So a year ago is probably close enough that most of the same things are probably the case. If there was a big change in something, you're probably going to know it, so you can invalidate the measure if you need to. And it gives you enough information to help you make a more informed decision. That's pretty much all you need.
Norms. Questions for reflection. What is the lifespan of the data you're collecting? Does the data need to be utilized immediately to be valuable, or can you use it as a historical norm? How often do you need to re-examine your norms to ensure they're valid?
Now, a proxy is another type of measurement similar to a norm. A proxy is measuring one quantity by measuring something else. So think of something in a democratic republic like the United States. Ideally, the leader of the country is elected by the popular will of the people, right? But you can't put every person in the country inside an MRI and do a detailed brain scan to form a map of the true will of every person. Can't do that, at least yet, right? So instead of measuring those things, we measure votes. And a vote cast by a person is a proxy for their preferences in that particular area of life. It's not measuring the actual thing, it's measuring thing that's tightly correlated with that thing. So it's not going to be 100% accurate, but it's going to be as close as we can possibly get. And the closer the proxy is to the related subject, the more accurate the proxy is. So proxies are really, really valuable to measure things that are hard to measure for some reason. If you can find something that comes kind of close, you have something that you can work with. You just have to make sure that the proxy you're choosing is highly correlated with what you're looking for. Can you think of other examples of proxies?
Unions.
Unions, how?
Because the union elects officials, and the officials go to the table and make a decision on how things are going to work.
Yep, that's
The same thing with Congress too.
yeah, that's proxy. Congress is a proxy for the people. Currency, how?
It's a approximated measure of value.
Yep,
So the dollar is
a proxy. If you go to your doctor and you have a physical taken and blood drawn, they will measure certain things in your blood that are proxies for an underlying physical condition, right? How much inflammation you have in your circulatory system can be estimated by the presence or absence of a certain hormone in your blood. That's a proxy. So proxies are super useful. You just have to make sure the correlation is there or they become not so useful.
Proxy. Questions for reflection. If you're having trouble measuring something, could you measure something else that's correlated with it? What proxies could you potentially use to triangulate into a better understanding of your subject?
Now, segmentation means splitting the data that you have available into subgroups to add additional context and find unknown relationships. So sometimes looking at the entire set of data you have is just too much. You don't learn enough from it. So segmenting that data, breaking it down, this is kind of the analytical version of deconstruction. You're deconstructing that data, splitting it into some groups to see if you can add some contrast to the data set. And there are roughly 3 ways to segment your data. First is past performance. So if you have some data that's generated by customers in your business, you can segment those customers by past actions, like what items have they purchased from you? When have they purchased from you? All of those characteristics based on actions that they have already taken, you can segment against any one of those things. The second way is demographics, which segments customers by external personal characteristics. This is where you get male or female, age, geographic location, all of those personal characteristics. You can analyze a data set of your customers who live in the eastern part of a country versus the western part of a country, or live on the northern end of town or the southern end of the town, or who are less than 25 years of age or more than 25 years of age. Any of those personal characteristics can be a dimension of segmentation. The third way to segment is psychographics, which segments customers by internal psychological characteristics. So preferences, responses on a survey, all of the things that are kind of proxies for how a person thinks or feels can be used as a dimension to segment against. By segmenting your data, you're collecting a whole lot of information. You're choosing a dimension to kind of split that data into different groups, and you treat each of those groups differently. So one very common segmentation in business is how do new customers to my business perform versus customers who are repurchasing from me? And that's a segmentation based on past performance. If they purchased from me before, I'll put them into one group, and they probably have some different characteristics than people who are finding me for the first time. Therefore, because now we kind of have 2 groups, the conclusions that we draw about the behavior of those 2 groups may be very different, and we might treat those 2 groups of customers very differently. Whereas if we looked at the data together as one big group, we wouldn't be able to figure that out.
And a wrinkle of that too is, so with property and casualty insurance, average lifetime, not value, average length of customer tenure will be, it varies, but let's say it's 11 years. So it's important to go back and say, for your new customers that you're looking at acquiring now, or that you have acquired now, don't look at them against your legacy customers overall, or for the same time, look at them when they were new customers. So if you have the data, look at the customer when your existing profitable book was a year old, against
Yes.
your new customers who are a year old, because that took a long time to work through.
That's a great example of a norm.
Because
Yeah.
you're comparing apples and oranges. What if you're a loss leader in some ways right now, betting on they're going to stay with you for a certain amount of time, customer lifetime value, and some are going to and some aren't. But you're betting on those that are going to extrapolate out or build out and bring the influencers and bring those people.
I love that example because
That tripped us up. Surprisingly, it tripped us up.
and that brings in like 12 of the things that we've talked about all throughout this course into a single analysis. Customer lifetime value, how long are they sticking with you? What did their purchase behavior look like? Segmenting on a characteristic, going back and looking at a historical norm. You're bringing all of this stuff together in a single analysis that will help you make a better decision. Which customers are we dealing with right now that are going to be the ones that are going to stick with us for 12 years and the lifetime value is going to look like this? Yeah, love that example. So the rule of segmentation is there are very, very, very few sets of data that the practice of segmentation cannot improve in some way, shape, or form. So just look for the relevant characteristics for your system or your business and segment along those lines.
Segmentation. Questions for reflection. What segmentation strategy makes the most sense for your measurements, given what you're trying to achieve? How can you use segmentation to understand what different groups or people or processes are doing?
Now, last idea in analyzing systems is humanization. And humanization is the process of using data to tell a story, which is an example of narrative, which we talked about earlier. So when we're collecting all of this information and all of this data, we're dealing with a lot of numbers and a lot of labels, and it's very easy to lose sight of the fact that those numbers and labels are related to the experience that a real, live, actual person is having in the real world with our system or with our company. So a good example that I like to use is, let's say you are managing a customer service center, a call center, and one of your key performance indicators is the average amount of time it takes to resolve a customer service call. And let's say it starts at 10 minutes. And you work and work and work and work and work, and you get to the point where the average customer time to serve is 8 minutes. Pop the champagne, you had a 20% improvement. Life is good. Until you realize that there's still, the person who dials that number is waiting on the phone for 8 minutes, and every minute that goes by, they're getting madder and madder and madder and hate your company more and more and more. So instead of celebrating, you should be realizing that from the perspective of the person who is waiting on the phone, you have a lot of work to do. So this is the idea of that David was talking about earlier, using your data to tell a story, and the story is about a person that is going through something that affects them and involves them working with your business. The data doesn't really become important until you tell the story, and the story is all about a real live human being. It's hard to look at a database or it's hard to look at a spreadsheet and see the stories. You have to look at the data, understand what the data means, and then start telling a story based on what the numbers are telling you. So telling the story will help you understand the data in a much more comprehensive way than just looking at the raw numbers will ever tell you.
Humanization. Questions for reflection. Can you translate your key performance indicators into tangible human behaviors? If not, what additional information do you need? How can you remember to see human behaviors when looking at data?